Thank you very much, Alon. What I propose to talk about today is really the work that I have been doing to discover for myself the real story and the data behind what I was being told about population growth when I first started to take an interest in this topic. And I was hearing all these memes about education for girls is the most important thing, or, population growth is already stabilizing now. And I found it very hard to find the references to the actual research work on which statements were based. And so I found that I had to go to the raw data myself and work it through for myself. And I found a very different story than the one that I had been hearing. So what I'm going to present today is quite data dense. So I hope you like charts, because I do a lot of charts. And it's also telling a bit of a different story than you will have heard elsewhere, because I'm finding a much clearer, stronger answer to the question of whether population growth is important for economic development than I have been hearing from the development community. Just not quite sure how to, I might have to shift screens into, oh yes, here we go, to advance the slides. So as Alon said, I was an agricultural scientist. I worked for quite a number of years on tropical root crops in the Pacific Islands, in Vietnam, and interacting with projects in Africa and elsewhere. That's me in the top photo in the floral dress with my field school participants in Vietnam. But it always disturbed me that agricultural development work pretended to be solving food security when it was not even remotely having any chance of solving food security in countries where population is growing rapidly. Vietnam's okay, they've got their fertility down, they're on the road to great things, and it's a very optimistic country because everything's improving rapidly on account of them already having their fertility down. Papua New Guinea is a different story altogether, and that country, my heart really bleeds for the people there who are really working hard to not go backwards because population growth is growing so rapidly. So it frustrated me that in my profession, you couldn't approach this subject. They just say, that's not our business, Well, if it's not your business, don't claim to be fixing food security, because that's not what you're doing. So, as you know, politically, this is an issue that is denied from all fronts, whether it's the energy crisis, the food crisis, the water crisis, or the environmental crisis. For religious and political reasons, let's pretend that none of these things are related to overpopulation. So most people have thought about population growth to some extent and have developed the key ideas that allow them to put the issue aside and to say that it's not a problem, and to say that the people who are going on about it have ulterior motives which we don't like. So the first excuse is that it's already stabilizing by itself. We don't have to do anything. The problem's fixing. As countries industrialize, the fertility comes down and then the population will stabilize. So, just hold your horses. It's all going to come out okay in the end. The other line is that the most effective way to reduce the population growth is pick your preferred option: poverty reduction, girls' education, or reducing infant mortality. what they're really saying, these are all things that the development agenda is doing anyway, and doing quite vigorously and with a considerable amount of success, except for poverty reduction. But the purpose in making this statement is to say that family planning programs are and were always unnecessary, ineffective and inappropriate. They don't explicitly say that, but it's the patronising way in which this argument is trotted out every time you raise population. It's saying, no, we should not proactively address population growth because we should be addressing it indirectly. So the next point is that, well, we're not full up yet, so none of today's problems are related to overpopulation. So you completely blinded yourself to the whole ramifications of population pressure and population growth rate that have their footprint in every single social and environmental issue that we face today. But the general discourse in society is that these things can be blamed on anything else but population pressure. And finally, the population growth is good for the economy. We need population growth to grow GDP, and growth is God. And particularly in the developed world, that we have ageing populations, so we desperately need more younger people in order to keep the workforce going to balance the number of old people. So I'm going to challenge all of those statements in this presentation. What it's important to know about population is that overpopulation is the central threat to sustainability. Almost all other sustainability measures are workarounds for population pressure. They're important, but they wouldn't be important if we didn't have so many people, you know. All other efforts will be undone if there's sufficient further growth. Now, a lot of people say, well, there won't be sufficient further growth, don't worry about it. But in fact, there will be sufficient further growth to cause an awful lot of backpedaling. Secondly, fertility decline has enabled economic advance, not the other way around. And it is by far the cheapest, fastest, most pro-poor way toward a sustainable future. Thirdly, it's not just about the scale of population. It's not just about the carrying capacity of our land. It's the rate at which population is growing that is holding countries back from development. The countries that have reduced their fertility rate and got on track to develop out of least developed to middle income countries have not yet started to shrink their population, but they have got off the treadmill of very, very rapid population growth. And that is the most important thing for their development. It's also very important that they don't get too developed before they get, too overpopulated before they get to that point, because then they simply won't have enough resources to achieve economic security. And finally, population degrowth is a choice we could make, and it's one we are not making. There's a concerted, willful blindness towards the very simple, cheap, humane, and rights-based things that we could be doing in this space, just by claiming that it's blaming the poor and it's unethical. So sustainability is like a three-legged stool. We're constantly, as soon as you mention population, someone will say, it's not all about population. And their preferred situation is that we don't speak about it at all. So it's the inclusion is exclusive fallacy. So, of course, we have to contract and converge in terms of resource use per person. Of course, we have to conserve and restore ecosystems because we have run them down so badly. But we must also end population growth, or all those other efforts don't stand for anything. If you take one leg out of that stool, it is not a stool. If we don't do all those three things, we do not have sustainability. The impacts of population growth are way higher than the impacts of climate change in a continent like Africa. And Africa is really where the business is for the next century. That's where most of the population growth is going to happen, which is not to say it's not important elsewhere. It's important everywhere. So in this first chart, I've taken the projected change in rainfall for 5 African countries out of a particular research paper. And they had, high and low estimates of where they thought it was going. And there's really not that much change in rainfall predicted in Africa on account of climate change. Of course, there will be other impacts in terms of the distribution of rainfall and the intensity and the likelihood of floods and droughts, and the evaporation rate will go up. But they're not massive changes. When we compare that with the change in population that is projected for those same countries, it is horrifying. Nobody talks about it. Africans don't know about it most of the time. They just can't get their head around the idea that there might be 5 or 6 people for every one today by the end of this century, sharing the same meagre land that's already becoming less fertile due to overuse. So these charts are showing the UN's median projection with the range showing the high and low variance on that projection. And the green dotted lines are my projection of what a proactive, population-focused family planning program could achieve in each of those countries. So for some of them, there'd still be a doubling of their current population, but you could get away with no more than a doubling. And that would be an enormous benefit to their ecological security. So I want to talk about this idea that population growth rate is such a brake on economic development, because we have been told over the last several decades, really since certainly since the 80s, that population growth is neutral for development, that every extra mouth is a pair of hands. And then since about the turn of the century, people have been realising that the economists are missing something, because high fertility countries are really not doing well economically. And everyone can see that it's a problem trying to keep up with the population growth rate. But economists did not have a theory for why this was a problem. So what they came up with was the demographic dividend, which is the idea that when the birth rate drops, you get a smaller proportion of children and a higher proportion of people of working age who are economically active, and they're the ones who boost the economic growth rate. What I have found is that there is actually no evidence that it's the proportion of working age that's giving any economic boost. What is giving the economic boost is not having to run so hard in order to stand still with infrastructure creation in particular. But the whole dynamics of a growing population are different to a stationary population. The oversupply of labour generates unemployment, low wages and poor work conditions. And because of low wages, the rich get richer, the poor get poorer, and scarce things like housing become more expensive, which means that a higher proportion of what people are spending goes to the owners of capital, not demand for other people's labour. So that constrains demand for labour. It's a downward spiral in this capture of wealth by the owners of capital. So you can really short-circuit that in a stabilising population because we don't need their capital anymore. We can get on with paying each other for the services that we yield to each other and have a sustainable and equitable economy. So this is really the work that that sucked me into this whole population area, because I was having a little hiatus in my agricultural science career. I thought, oh, well, if I'm not being paid, I can work on the things that I think are important. And why isn't anybody pointing out how much it costs to grow the population? And I realised economists hadn't actually calculated this. So this is just an illustration of the rationale that the quality of life we have in a country like Israel or Australia depends on the stock of durable man-made assets that we have. All the infrastructure, all the equipment, all our furnishings, all our vehicles, all our schools and hospitals, and also our trained personnel, the number of doctors per capita, the number of, engineers and lawyers and whatever. So all of those things require an investment up front before you can enjoy the services of them over a long period of time. So we're spending a certain amount of our total economic activity in creating these things. And if you look at the lifespan, it tells you what proportion we have to create every year. So if power stations last 50 years on average, we'd need to build new power stations at a rate of 2% of our total stock every year. If our municipal buses are in fleet for about 10 years, we need to replace 10% of the fleet per year in order to maintain the fleet. So I think you can see where the maths is going. If nurses work in nursing for roughly 25 years each after graduation, some of them will work for 40 years, some of them will give up, a lot sooner than that, let's say. We have to graduate 4% of the nursing workforce every year to maintain that supply of nurses to the population. But look what happens if the population grows at 1% in 1 year. It sounds like a small figure, but suddenly we need 1% more power stations, we need 1% more buses, we need 1% more nurses, we need 1% more of everything. So instead of building 2% of our stock of power stations, we're building 3%. So what that's done to our cost is increased it by 50%, because 3% is 50% more than 2%. So instead of buying 10% of our bus fleet, we've got to buy 11%. That's a 10% increase in our costs. So you can see the last column is the same as the first column. The working lifespan in years is the same as the increased burden of paying for durable assets that we get for 1% population growth. If it's 2% population growth, it's even double that. So if all our big infrastructure, and that's by far the biggest cost to society, lasts about 50 years, then a 2% per annum population growth, which is what Israel is nearly at, doubles the infrastructure bill. So you might, even if those extra people are equally well employed, you might expect 2% more revenue, but you've got 100% more cost. That doesn't really add up. So the answer to that is that people say, oh, well, infrastructure, you don't have to worry about paying for infrastructure because it's an investment and it pays for itself. So I wanted to challenge this idea that when you're buying infrastructure just to keep pace with population growth, not to improve the amount of provision per person, that is not an investment, that's a recurrent cost. And this diagram is depicting our total stock of investment of durable assets in year one which has a depreciation rate to year 2, and we have to build a certain amount to replace what has depreciated. On top of that, we've got to build a certain amount to keep pace with population growth. And then on top of that, we could possibly improve the provision of infrastructure per capita. That improvement we could call an investment. But all of this stuff under the demand curve is recurrent cost. That's just what we have to do in order to not go backwards. So what happens if we can't actually afford within budget all of that? Then we end up with either a budget deficit or an infrastructure deficit. And the next year, that deficit just gets bigger. There's no point at which the investment in infrastructure is actually going to pay us back. It just gets bigger and bigger debt. So how big is this cost? So what I did was look at 40 years worth of data on gross fixed capital expenditure and how much we spend on tertiary education and on other durable assets. And it costs around 7% of GDP for 1% population growth rate. So if you're growing at 1.9% per annum, you're spending 13% of your GDP just running to stand still. That's a big chunk of discretionary spending. When you think a large proportion of GDP is just surviving, you know, the ability to improve people's lives is very much constrained by that big ticket item. In Australia, that's around $500,000 per person we add to the population. That's not the government expenditure. The government expenditure is around a quarter of that. It's certainly more than $100,000 per person. So the total expenditure includes building houses, building workplaces, equipping those things with vehicles and equipment and etc. So in the meantime, we're spending all this money growing, displacing nature, using non-renewable resources and creating more pollution, inflating housing and making household debt worse. And what are the benefits that compensate for these disbenefits? So one of the benefits that we're being told about is ageing. The ageing population is going to shrink the workforce and create, you know, a shrinking economy, and we're all going to be poor and nobody's going to be there to look after us in our nursing homes when we get old. It is all complete baloney. And these charts are showing all of the OECD countries with the percent of population employed versus the proportion of people who are aged over 65 or the proportion of people who are aged 15 to 64, which is usually designated as a working age group. In neither case is there any trend where the older countries have lower workforce. What has happened is that as countries have aged, they get less unemployment, not less employment. There's actually a surplus of working age people wanting to work, even if they're not officially unemployed. They will enter the workforce if work is offered on the right terms for them. So the ageing story is a complete myth. The other one that we get in Australia is that we need to fill skills gaps. And this cartoon rather sums up the situation very nicely, that a great many of those migrants are not working in the skills area that they're supposedly given a visa for, and are being exploited in very poor working conditions, just to bring people in order to mainly fill up our universities with overseas students and to increase the price of real estate for the benefit of property developers. So how much future population growth is choice? This is what we really need to understand in order to know how hard we need to push on this subject, because what can we achieve by getting any change in policy? So most people think that population growth is already slowing down by itself. If you look at the historical path of world population, it's not actually showing any sign of flattening out yet. In 1968, it reached its peak growth rate at 2.1% per annum. And in that year, there were 73 million people added to the planet. In 2010, the growth rate is only 1.2%, but we added 81 million people. So the growth hasn't slowed at all. It's only that the total population doubled and therefore the growth rate halved. But that is not a solution. The United Nations projections anticipate around 11 billion by the end of this century. That's the blue line, is the medium fertility projection. This chart also shows the low fertility and high fertility projections, which are basically half a child less or half a child more than the medium fertility projection. And even they rely on fertility going down in high fertility countries. If fertility didn't go down, it would follow this pink line, which reaches something like 28 billion people by 2100. Now, of course, we will not feed 28 billion people. Something else will happen. So we always need to remember that projections are completely blind to resource constraints. They're just projecting past patterns into the future without anticipating any roadblocks that might happen if there's not enough water or not enough food, for instance, or not enough energy or too much greenhouse gases. So this is just diagrammatic, of course, but I've chosen to fade it out in the range of 7 to 12 billion people, which is the zone that the demographer Joel Cohen came up with as the... he did a survey of all the efforts that had been published to estimate a carrying capacity for planet Earth. So those estimates fall somewhere in the range of 7 to 12 billion. So we're already in the zone. We're already potentially overpopulated, and every step further towards resource constraints increases our risk of major cataclysmic mortality events. So in order to turn the population around through more deaths instead of fewer births would take an extra 100 million premature deaths per year, every year, for decades. That's what's at stake. If we don't get the birth rate down, that's what we'll face, because nature is not doing deals here. Just by comparison, the AIDS epidemic has killed about 40 million people over 40 years. And we're talking about 100 million per year, every year, would rip the global system apart. You know, this is a lot bigger than COVID-19. So we need to bear in mind that what we're really talking about is not just our preference not to be so crowded. It is to deflect this existential risk of precipitating a mortality event. Now, over recent years, the UN has been underestimating the population growth that's been happening, because fertility was falling quite nicely in the 80s and into the 90s, and then it stalled in a lot of places. And so their estimate for the global population has actually gone up by 2 billion people just in the space of 11 years, it was recalculated that far. So it's kind of settled now around the 11 billion level, but they're still underestimating recent growth. So the fact that they're not projecting higher growth towards the end of the century means that they've actually had to anticipate faster fertility growth than they were before, even though what's been happening has been happening slower than they were anticipating. So it's a bit of a political juggle there, and I don't believe that they're actually presenting the most likely outcome on current settings. You might have come across this fellow called Hans Rosling, who does a lot of, or did, unfortunately he died a couple of years ago, but he did a lot of online YouTube videos with very upbeat stories about how fertility is falling as the wealth of countries increases, and it's all turning out nicely, and, you know, actually most of the indicators for human well-being are improving everywhere in the world, and we're all going to get there in the end. There are a lot of problems with that story, and he's unfortunately been responsible for building a lot of complacence in the world community. So what has been happening is that the increment of world population is shown in this chart. It was coming down in the 90s from a peak in about 1988 or 89, and everyone said, see, we've passed the hump, population's on the way to stabilising, and then around 2000 it started going up again. And we need to remember that everyone's saying that fertility is going to fall because we're reducing poverty and educating girls and reducing infant mortality. Well, over this same period from 2000, under the Millennium Development Goals, and that's the precursor to the Sustainable Development Goals, so the UN's main development agenda from the year 2000 to 2015 were the Millennium Development Goals. And they achieved quite rapid success on infant mortality and girls' education, and not too bad on reducing poverty. Despite those things, fertility stalled and the number of births per year went up quite pronounced way in some countries. So what explains this fall? And the main thing that explains it is that aid funding for family planning basically fell dramatically during that period from the mid-90s due to a change in the UN policy on population growth, which was changed from we need to reduce population growth through family planning programs for the sake of development in underdeveloped countries to a position which said we shouldn't problematise population growth because that encourages countries to put in place coercive measures to force people to not have babies. So therefore we should only focus on women's reproductive health and rights. Now the problem with that, it would be a lovely thing if it worked, but it didn't work because the funding fell out of family planning, so it actually achieved a withdrawal of support for women's reproductive health and rights. It was counterproductive to its own aims. So if we now look at the projections going forward, the medium projection from the UN says that all of those high fertility countries will resume their fertility decline quite rapidly. If we look at the annual data that comes out from the Population Reference Bureau, it hasn't been tracking that UN's projection. It's been exceeding it quite markedly, and it's basically been following the constant fertility projection. That's the one that heads very rapidly towards resource constraints and a calamity. So this is the path we're on. We have to do something differently to get off this path. We have to be more proactive. So I went looking to see which countries had reduced fertility rapidly and what did they do to achieve that. And these are some of the countries. And they all had strong national family planning programs. And the timing of that fall in fertility is very clearly the timing of the program. You know, whatever else was going on for them, at the time they started the program, that's the time that fertility started falling. So we know that countries can reduce fertility rapidly, all the way to below the replacement rate, which is this dotted line. So below that dotted line, population stabilisation is eventually possible. Above the dotted line, you'll slow population growth, but you'll still end up with too many people. So we need to actually aim to get fertility below the 2.1 level. It's not good enough to say we've just met unmet need for family planning and people are only having the number of children they want. They have to want fewer than 2.1. Otherwise, we've got an ecological problem. So then I looked at different countries in the same world region that had different population policies and say, is there an economic advantage that is triggering this propensity to run family planning programs and the propensity to have fertility fall? Can we really make any case that the economy is helping in this fertility fall? And in this particular pair, there's Thailand and the Philippines, which both had about 30 million people in 1970. Thailand was poorer than the Philippines. It had much lower levels of education. It brought in a family planning program. So what happened is that after fertility fell, in the middle chart we have GDP per capita. It was only after fertility fell that Thailand's GDP per capita started to take off. Philippines has been sluggish all of that time. So then on the right-hand side, I've plotted the fertility rate as a function of GDP per capita. So the demographic transition theory, which says that as countries get wealthier, their fertility will fall, would anticipate a convex curve where the fertility stays high until they get rich enough and then it would start coming down. But what we see is a concave curve where fertility fell first and then the economy took off. But the really interesting thing is that the family planning country and the non-family planning country are parallel. They're both going on the same path. It's just the family planning countries going there faster. So I did the same comparison in different world regions, and there are lots of variations in the course of that different countries took, but they all have this same pattern. They all show a divergence after the fertility fell. They all show concave curves where it doesn't matter whether you did family planning or you didn't do family planning, they're on the same track. The fertility has to come down before the economy takes off. And down the bottom here, I've got China and India, the Asian giants. And I just want to point out that the one-child policy came in after the fertility fell in China. They had a voluntary program brought in the late 60s, which trained up community health workers and put them in every village to promote family planning and provide contraception. And the fertility had already come down very rapidly before the one-child policy came in. So we don't need to support coercive measures at all. There's no instance where coercive measures have been shown to be beneficial to fertility decline. It's all been done by voluntary family planning. The girls' education story is really quite complex and messy, and in most places over the same period of time, more girls have got educated and fertility has come down, but the case can't be made that the education drove rapid fertility decline. Certainly it helps, but some countries have managed to reduce fertility while education was still quite low. Here is Morocco, for instance, in North Africa, where others had quite high levels of education, like the Philippines, without fertility falling. And in sub-Saharan Africa, most sub-Saharan African countries have had very little fertility decline. I've just chosen a few here that did have a period of fertility decline. But most of them had quite rapid increase in girls' education. Nigeria here is in the pink triangles, has had around 75% girls' primary school completion for decades, but fertility has gone nowhere. So we can't say that just educating girls is going to drive fertility decline. So when I tried to publish that work, I was told that, and these journals tend to be very conservative on this matter, I was told that I hadn't proven causation. And I thought that's odd, because I thought what I was doing was showing that the demographic transition theory hadn't proven causation. You know, I wasn't proving causation, I was questioning causation. So anyway, I thought, how can I better demonstrate or test causation? So this plot was not looking at individual countries, but all countries in all 5-year periods for which there were World Bank data, grouped by the level of GDP per capita across the bottom against the change in total fertility rate. So the rate at which fertility is declining, is that in any way related to wealth? And the answer is no. There is no pattern there. So if we flip it the other way, does economic development depend on fertility decline? Okay. We've got levels of fertility versus change in GDP per capita over the next 5 years for all countries. And as you can see, with fertility above 4, virtually no country is doing anything in terms of economic development. It's an absolute brake on development. So why is the development industry so disinterested in this? There are a few dots up the top. They're mostly Oman and a couple of other oil states that for a period in the 70s and 80s were showing rapid economic development. But when they run out of oil, like Syria has found, it's a big problem. So it's not just fertility, it's population growth rate. So it doesn't matter if it's through immigration or through high births. High population growth rate is a huge brake on economic advance. That's all countries for all 5-year periods for which there was data in the World Bank. So then what I did, and we're getting quite close to the end, so another 3 to 5 minutes, perhaps. I thought, okay, for the purposes of projecting what could be achieved, what was the average experience under different policy settings? So what I did was take all of the countries that had fertility above 5 in 1950 and group them according to the fastest fertility fall that they experienced in any 20-year period. So the ones that achieved more than 1.5 units per decade are in the green group, the fast group, and they all had family planning programs. And then in the purple group is ones who had fertility decline between 0.5 and 1.5, and the red group are less than 0.5 per decade. So these are all developing countries sorted on no criterion other than the rate of fertility decline. And then I've synchronised them to the start of their fertility decline so that I could get an average experience. So instead of year, we've got year naught being the start of their fertility decline, or where there wasn't a start, it's 1970. Okay, so what happened to their population? Now, even the green group have doubled their population over 40 years. You can't stop population growth overnight, but they are now tapering off and are about to end their population growth at that point. The slow fertility decline countries haven't yet reduced the birth rate faster than they've increased the number of mothers. So they're still adding more people per year than they ever did before. They'll get there in the end if fertility keeps falling, but so far they haven't even slowed population growth. The red group, the non-family planning countries that have only seen a trickle of fertility decline, have tripled their population in 40 years, and they've got another doubling in the pipeline, even if they act now. What happened to them economically? The development industry has been telling us, supposedly based on research, that population growth is irrelevant to development. That chart is not compatible with that conclusion. It's showing that high population growth countries where fertility did not fall fast have gone nowhere economically on average. The family planning countries that reduced fertility rapidly have taken off. And if we plot them as I did before with the fertility as a function of GDP per capita, they're all on the same path. I nearly fell off my chair when I did this graph, because the development industry has been telling us that population growth is not an issue for development for decades. And this chart is telling us there is no other way than to get fertility down first before the economy can move forward. So then I took that average experience that family planning countries in the past have achieved and said, if the remaining high fertility countries adopted that sort of policy, what would happen to their population? And then did that for each of those countries from the level of fertility that they have now, and added it all up into a global population, and that gave me this green line. So it would be technically possible to get something like this green line, which is close to the UN's low projection. On the business as usual path, it's tracking well above the UN's median projection, towards around 13 billion by the end of this century. A very hazardous path to take in terms of food security or climate change. So a peak under 9 billion is still technically possible, but would require very rapid uptake of proactive policies. Every year that we delay adds about 100 million people to the peacefully achievable global peak. That is, if we avoid major mortality events, the peak will be pushed up by about 100 million just by delaying 1 year. So this is really urgent. People say, oh, you know, there are much more urgent things because population growth is too slow to react. Well, if it's slow to react, it's all the more urgent that we do it now. It's like planting a tree. You know, they say the best time to plant a forest was 80 years ago, but the next best time is today. Because the sooner you do it, the sooner you get to these big gains that are decades away in the future. So, family planning is really the low-hanging fruit for not only for climate change but for development, and it costs a lot less than it saves directly in unneeded services to women and children, let alone all of the other benefits that are derived from it. That's the end. I'm very open to questions. Thank you.